The alarm on the outpost never stopped. That is the first thing I remember, and it is the thing I remember most clearly, even now, after all these years. I was standing in the command room of the listening post at the edge of our border, and the screen in front of me showed nothing but static, where a full company of soldiers used to be. One moment my friend Torin was speaking to me through the comm line, laughing about something small, something that does not matter anymore. The next moment, there was only noise. Not an explosion, not a scream, just noise, and then nothing at all. I want to tell you now, before I say anything else, that I am not going to make the humans sound like monsters. I am not going to make them sound like heroes either. I am going to tell you what I saw, and what I felt, and you can decide for yourself what kind of people they are. But I will tell you this much right now, so you understand why my hands still shake sometimes when I speak of them. We were not afraid of losing that outpost. We were afraid because we did not understand how we lost it. My name is Doran Vale. I served for 11 years in the fleet of the Ostari Compact, and for 6 of those years I fought against the humans of Earth. When people ask me now what it was like, they expect me to talk about our weapons, or their weapons, or the size of our fleets. They expect numbers. They want to hear about how many ships we had and how many ships they had, as if a war can be understood through numbers. It cannot. A war is understood through the small moments, the ones that stay with you long after the counting is finished. I was young when it started, only 26 years old by our calendar, which is close enough to a human's 26 that the comparison holds. I had trained for combat since I was a child. My family had a long history of service, and I was proud to carry it forward. When the officers at the academy told us that a new species had appeared at the edge of known space, one that had built ships and jumped between stars far sooner than any of the calculations said they should have, we were curious more than worried. We had fought other species before. We had always won, sometimes easily, sometimes with difficulty, but always in the end we had won. The first reports about humans were almost funny to us. They came from a small world called Earth, a world with only one moon and one dominant species, unlike most worlds where several species compete for the same resources. Their bodies were soft compared to ours. Their technology was inconsistent, brilliant in some places and primitive in others, as if they had built a beautiful house on top of a foundation made of mismatched stone. Our analysts said they would be simple to deal with. A short conflict, they said, a demonstration of strength, and then a peace treaty on our terms. I believed that too, in the beginning. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what comes later. I was not afraid of humans when this began. None of us were. The listening post I told you about was the first place we lost contact with. It was a small station, nothing important on its own, built only to watch the border between our territory and the edge of human expansion. We had expected the humans to be cautious there, since our numbers in that sector were far greater than theirs. Instead, something came through that sector that erased 40 soldiers and an entire station in less than 1 hour, and left no wreckage large enough to explain what had happened. When my unit was sent to investigate, I remember standing on the deck of our ship, looking out at empty space where the station used to be, and feeling a kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. There was no debris field. There were no distress signals recorded before the silence. It was as if the station had simply stopped existing, and the only proof that anything violent had happened at all was the absence where something used to be. Our commanding officer at the time, a hardened veteran named Kess Orvin, told us not to worry. He said the humans had likely used some kind of experimental weapon, something unstable that would not work a second time. He said we would find them, punish them, and return home within the month. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. We did not return home within the month. We did not return home for 6 years. The first time I saw a human ship with my own eyes, I remember being surprised by how small it was. Our vessels were built for comfort as well as combat, with wide corridors and crew quarters meant to house soldiers for long deployments in reasonable conditions. The human ship on our scanners was cramped, efficient, almost aggressive in its design, as if every piece of it existed only to serve a single purpose, and comfort was never considered at all. It looked like a blade instead of a home. We outnumbered that ship 3-1. 3 of our cruisers against one of their smaller vessels, in open space, with no cover and no support for them anywhere in the system. Any other species we had fought would have surrendered, or fled, or at the very least, attempted a desperate final gesture before accepting the inevitable. That is not what happened. The human ship turned directly toward us. I remember the silence on our bridge in that moment. Not confusion exactly, but something close to it. Our tactical officer said the ship was on a collision course, and for a moment none of us understood why a single vessel would fly straight at 3 larger ships instead of running or defending itself in a more sensible pattern. Then the human ship opened fire, not at our largest cruiser, which would have been the obvious target, but at the smallest of our 3 vessels, the one carrying our fuel reserves for the return journey. It was not a decision meant to win the battle. It was a decision meant to make sure that whatever happened to them, we would suffer for a long time afterward. And it worked. We destroyed that single human ship within minutes, but the damage to our fuel reserves meant we spent the next several weeks limping back through hostile space with barely enough power to keep our life support functioning. A trade, one small ship for weeks of our suffering. I did not understand yet what kind of thinking produced a decision like that. I only knew that it disturbed me more than any battle I had fought before. That was the first time I asked myself a question that would follow me for the rest of the war. What kind of people choose to hurt you on their way out, when hurting you serves no purpose in winning? I spoke with Kess Orvin that night, in the quiet section of the ship where the officers took their meals. I asked him what he thought about what we had seen. He told me not to overthink it. He said the humans were desperate, and desperate creatures behave in strange ways, and once we broke their spirit properly, this kind of behavior would stop. I wanted to believe him again. I always wanted to believe the simple explanation, because the alternative was harder to accept. The alternative was that this was not desperation at all. This was simply how they fought. Over the following weeks, we encountered small groups of human ships in 3 more engagements, none of them large battles, all of them strange in ways I struggled to explain in my reports. In one encounter, a human vessel with failing engines refused every opportunity to retreat, choosing instead to draw our fire away from 2 smaller ships that were attempting to evacuate wounded soldiers from a damaged outpost nearby. In another, a group of humans aboard a supply ship destroyed their own cargo rather than allow it to be captured, even though the cargo itself was nothing more valuable than food and medical supplies. I remember asking one of our engineers, a calm and thoughtful person named Mira Thess, why she thought the humans behaved this way. She told me something I have never forgotten. She said, perhaps they are not fighting to win the war. Perhaps they are fighting so that whoever wins it will remember exactly how much it cost. I did not understand her fully at the time. I understand her completely now. By the time our unit returned to friendly space for repairs and resupply, I had changed in ways I could not name yet. I still believed we would win the war. Our numbers were greater, our fleet was larger, our technology, in most areas, remained superior. But somewhere inside me, a quiet doubt had begun to grow, a doubt that had nothing to do with strength or weapons or numbers. It was a doubt about what kind of enemy we had made, and whether victory against such an enemy would look anything like the victories we had known before. I remember standing on the observation deck of our repair station, looking out at the stars, and thinking about Torin, my friend from the listening post, and the silence that had swallowed him whole. I did not know yet that the silence was only the beginning. I did not know yet how much more I would learn about the humans, about their strength, about their strange and unbreakable will, and about the terrible cost of facing an enemy who refused, in every single circumstance, to simply give up. I only knew that something had shifted in the war, and in me, and that there was no going back to the confidence I had carried before that first mission. The war had only just begun, and already I understood that we were not fighting the enemy we had expected to fight. We were fighting something else entirely, and I would spend the next 6 years of my life learning exactly what that meant. The first real battle came 4 months after we returned to friendly space. I say real because everything before it had been small, scattered, almost accidental in nature. What happened next was different. It was planned, it was large, and it was the moment our entire fleet finally understood what kind of war we were truly in. Our commanders had located a human colony world called Aster Hollow, a settlement of perhaps 200,000 people, positioned on the far edge of their expanding territory. It was not a military target in the traditional sense. It had some manufacturing capability, some agricultural value, but nothing that made it strategically vital on its own. Our commanders chose it because it was lightly defended, and because taking it would send a clear message to the human government that their expansion had a cost. I remember the briefing before we departed. Kess Orvin stood in front of the assembled officers and told us that intelligence reports showed only a handful of ships stationed near the colony, along with basic ground defenses that would not withstand a serious assault. He said we would take the system within 2 days, establish a blockade, and force the colony's surrender without significant losses on either side. It sounded simple. It sounded, in fact, exactly like the kind of victory we had always expected against the humans. We arrived at the edge of the system with 18 warships. The human defenders had 6. I was aboard one of our support cruisers during the initial approach, monitoring the sensor arrays alongside 2 other officers. When the human ships appeared on our scans, there was a strange quiet across our fleet communications. 6 ships against 18 was not a battle. It was a formality. I remember one of the younger officers on our channel laughing, saying that the humans must have known this was coming, and simply had not bothered to prepare a real defense, since none would have mattered anyway. I did not laugh. Something about the way those 6 ships were positioned bothered me, though I could not explain why at the time. They were not clustered together for mutual protection, as our own doctrine would have suggested. They were spread across the system in a wide pattern, almost as if they wanted to be found individually rather than as a group. The battle began when our lead ships moved to establish the blockade perimeter. Within minutes, everything I thought I understood about human tactics was proven wrong all over again. The 6 human ships did not attempt to fight our main fleet directly. Instead, they scattered further, using the terrain of the system itself, the asteroid fields and gas clouds and debris from an old mining operation, to break apart our formation and force individual engagements rather than one large battle. Our 18 ships were built to fight as a coordinated whole, supporting one another with overlapping defensive fire and combined sensor data. Against 6 scattered opponents using unpredictable terrain, that coordination became a weakness instead of a strength. I watched from the sensor station as one of our largest cruisers, a vessel I had served aboard during training exercises years before, pursued a single human fighter into the edge of an asteroid field. The fighter was smaller, faster, and far more maneuverable in tight spaces. It led our cruiser through a narrow channel between 2 large asteroids, then turned sharply and fired directly into an unstable section of rock that our sensors had flagged only hours earlier as structurally weak from centuries of collisions. The resulting collapse did not destroy our cruiser, but it damaged the ship's primary engines badly enough to remove it from the battle entirely. That was not luck. That was a pilot who had studied the terrain before the battle even began, who had planned an engagement point months, maybe years in advance, using nothing more than public survey data of an old mining colony that our own intelligence had dismissed as irrelevant. I began to understand, in that moment, that the humans were not simply reacting to us. They were preparing for us, studying us, anticipating exactly how we would fight, long before we ever arrived. It was a deeply unsettling realization, because it meant every advantage we believed we held, in numbers, in technology, in experience, could be turned against us by an enemy patient enough to study our patterns and disciplined enough to wait for the perfect moment to exploit them. The battle continued for nearly 6 hours, far longer than any engagement we had planned for. One by one, the 6 human ships were destroyed or forced to retreat, but not before they had disabled or damaged 9 of our 18 vessels. 9 ships, crippled or destroyed, by a defending force that outnumbered them 3-1 against our favor. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it was the number that changed how our entire fleet thought about this war. But the battle itself was not the moment that stayed with me most. What stayed with me happened afterward, during the ground assault on the colony itself. Our remaining forces landed on Aster Hollow expecting minimal resistance, since intelligence reports had indicated only basic civilian defenses. What we found instead was a colony that had spent months quietly preparing every building, every road, every open field, as a potential point of resistance. Ordinary civilians, farmers and engineers and teachers, had been trained in basic combat by the small handful of military personnel stationed there. They did not have advanced weapons. Many of them fought with equipment that would have seemed almost laughably primitive to our soldiers. And still, they fought. I remember one particular moment from the reports that came back from our ground units, a moment that several of my fellow soldiers spoke about for months afterward. A small group of colonists, no more than a dozen people, had taken position inside a grain storage building near the center of the settlement. They had no advanced weapons, only basic firearms and improvised barriers made from farming equipment. Our ground forces, better armed and vastly more experienced, expected the position to fall within minutes. It held for over 4 hours. When our soldiers finally moved in, they found that the defenders had used every advantage of the terrain, every piece of improvised cover, every moment of confusion in the smoke and dust, to slow our advance far longer than should have been possible. Several of our soldiers were injured in that engagement, not because the defenders were skilled fighters in any technical sense, but because they refused, at every single opportunity, to stop resisting. There was no point at which they simply gave up. There was no point at which the pressure became too much and they surrendered to save themselves. They fought until they physically could not fight any longer. I spoke to one of the soldiers involved in that assault later, a steady and normally unshakable officer named Rurik Aln. He told me something that has stayed with me for the rest of my life. He said that in all his years of service, he had never fought an enemy that made him feel like the aggressor before. He said that facing those 12 farmers in that storage building felt less like a battle and more like watching something get pushed past every reasonable limit, and refusing, even then, to break. The colony fell, eventually. We took Aster Hollow, established our blockade, and reported the mission a success to our command. But there was no celebration aboard our ships that night. I remember walking through the corridors of my vessel and seeing quiet faces everywhere, soldiers who had expected an easy victory and instead found themselves questioning everything they thought they understood about the nature of this war. I think that was the moment our entire fleet stopped seeing the humans as a simple obstacle to be removed and started seeing them as something far more dangerous. Not dangerous because of their weapons, which remained, in most respects, inferior to our own. Dangerous because of something inside them that we did not have a word for yet, something that made ordinary people, farmers and engineers, hold a position for 4 hours against soldiers who should have overwhelmed them in minutes. I asked Mira Thess, the engineer who had spoken to me about cost and memory after our earlier encounters, what she thought was happening. She told me that every species we had fought before understood war as a transaction, a calculation of losses and gains, and that most reasonable creatures stopped fighting once the calculation clearly favored surrender. The humans, she said, did not seem to calculate the same way. For them, it seemed, surrender itself carried a cost greater than any battlefield loss, a cost measured in something other than resources or lives. I did not fully understand what she meant, not then. I understood it much better later, after I had seen more battles, after I had lost more friends, after I had watched humans do things that no rational calculation should have allowed. But even in that early moment, standing on the deck of a ship counting our damaged vessels after what should have been an easy victory, I understood enough to know that everything I had believed about this war, and about the enemy we faced, had been wrong from the very beginning. We had come expecting a short campaign against a technologically inferior species. What we found instead was a people who treated every inch of ground, every ship, every life, as something worth an almost unbearable cost to defend. And somewhere in that realization, though I did not want to admit it at the time, a small part of me had already begun to respect them, even as I feared what that respect might mean for how long this war would last, and how much it would eventually take from all of us. There is one memory from this war that I have never spoken about publicly before today, and I want to be careful in how I tell it, because it is the memory that changed me more than any other single event across all 6 years of fighting. It happened during the second year of the war, aboard a human vessel that my unit boarded after a prolonged engagement near a supply route we had been sent to disrupt. I need to explain first how boarding actions worked between our two species, because they were unlike anything either side had experienced in previous conflicts. Most wars we had fought before involved distant engagements, ships firing across vast distances, rarely coming close enough for direct physical contact between crews. The humans changed that. Their ships were built for close combat in ways ours were not, and more than once, engagements between our forces ended not with the destruction of a vessel, but with soldiers from both sides fighting through narrow corridors, room by room, in conditions that felt closer to the oldest kind of conflict imaginable than to the advanced warfare either of our species claimed to represent. The ship we boarded that day was called the Halden Reach, a mid-sized transport vessel that our intelligence believed was carrying critical supplies to a human outpost further along the border. We had disabled its primary engines during a short exchange of fire, and our commanders ordered a boarding party to seize the ship rather than destroy it outright, since capturing the cargo intact was considered more valuable than eliminating the crew. I was part of that boarding party, along with 11 other soldiers under the command of an officer named Tovin Cass. We expected minimal resistance, since our scans indicated the vessel carried only a small crew, mostly technical personnel rather than trained soldiers. We were wrong about that, though not in the way you might expect. The crew of the Halden Reach numbered 14 people. Only 3 of them were trained combat personnel. The rest were engineers, cargo handlers, and medical staff, people whose jobs had nothing to do with fighting. And yet, when we breached the outer hull and began moving through the ship, every single one of them resisted us in whatever way they could. I remember moving through a narrow maintenance corridor and finding an engineer, a woman whose name I later learned was Grace Bennett, standing in front of a sealed door with nothing but a length of pipe in her hands. She was not a soldier. She had no training that our sensors could detect, no military background in her records. And still, she stood in that corridor, between our advancing squad and whatever lay beyond that door, and she did not move. Tovin Cass ordered her to stand aside. She did not respond in words. She simply held her position, the pipe raised, her breathing visible even through the low light of the corridor, and I understood in that moment that she was not going to move, regardless of what we said or did. She was afraid. I could see that clearly. Her hands were shaking. But the fear did not translate into surrender, the way it would have for almost any other species I had encountered. It translated into a kind of stillness, a refusal that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with something else, something I would spend years trying to understand. We were forced to subdue her, though I want to be clear that no lasting harm came to her that day. She was restrained and moved to a secure area of the ship, along with the rest of the crew we encountered. But what she was protecting behind that door stayed with me far longer than the encounter itself. Behind that sealed door was a medical bay, and inside the medical bay were 4 wounded crew members from an earlier engagement, people too injured to fight or flee, people who would have been entirely defenseless if we had breached that door with hostile intent. Grace Bennett, an engineer with no combat training, had positioned herself as the last line of defense between an armed boarding party and 4 wounded colleagues she barely knew, using nothing but a length of pipe and her own unwillingness to step aside. I asked her, later, through a translator, why she had done it. I remember this conversation more clearly than almost anything else from the entire war. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and her answer was simple in a way that has never left me. She said that someone had to stand there, and there was no one else available, so it had to be her. There was no calculation in that answer, no assessment of odds, no consideration of whether her resistance would actually succeed, just a simple, almost unbearable sense of duty toward people she happened to be responsible for in that moment, a duty she honored, even though honoring it meant almost certainly losing. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can count in the years since. I have tried to explain to younger soldiers what it meant, and I have never found the right words, because the concept itself does not translate easily between our people and theirs. For us, duty is something assigned, something structured, something you carry because your position requires it of you. For Grace Bennett, in that moment, duty seemed to be something entirely personal, something that existed independent of orders, or structure, or even reasonable hope of success. This pattern repeated itself across the war in ways too numerous to count individually, but I want to tell you about one more moment, because it involves the strangest thing I ever witnessed from human soldiers, something that unsettled our entire fleet more than any weapon or tactic could have. It happened during a prisoner exchange roughly 8 months after the incident aboard the Halden Reach. Our forces had captured a small group of human soldiers during a ground engagement, and negotiations through neutral channels had arranged for their return in exchange for several of our own soldiers held by human forces. These exchanges were rare, formal, conducted with careful procedure on both sides, since neither species fully trusted the other, even in matters of basic humanitarian exchange. I was present at this particular exchange as part of the security detail, standing at a safe distance while representatives from both sides completed the transfer. I remember watching the human prisoners as they were released from our custody and walked across the open ground toward their own people. They had been held for several weeks by that point, and by any reasonable measure they should have appeared exhausted, perhaps relieved, perhaps simply eager to return to their own side as quickly as possible. Instead, as they walked, I heard them talking to one another, laughing even, in a quiet way that seemed entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. One of them, a young soldier named Daniel Ford, made some kind of joke as they crossed the open ground, something about the food we had provided during their captivity, and the others laughed with him, genuine laughter, the kind that comes easily between people who trust each other completely. I did not understand it at the time. It seemed almost disrespectful, given everything they had endured, given the danger they had faced, and the danger many of their comrades continued to face at that very moment, elsewhere in the war. I asked one of our translators about it afterward, a patient scholar named Ilira Voth who had studied human culture extensively before and during the war. She told me something that reframed how I understood human behavior for the rest of the conflict. She said that humans often used humor as a way of managing fear, of maintaining connection with one another during moments of extreme stress, and that laughter in dangerous circumstances was not disrespect toward the danger itself, but rather a refusal to let the danger have complete control over their emotional state. She said it was, in its own strange way, another form of the same resistance we had seen from Grace Bennett standing in that corridor, a refusal to surrender, expressed not through fighting, but through simply continuing to be themselves, even in circumstances designed to strip that identity away. I found this deeply unsettling when I first heard it, and I still find it somewhat unsettling now, though I understand it far better than I did then. We had expected an enemy that could be broken through sufficient pressure, an enemy whose resistance had a measurable limit that our overwhelming advantages in numbers and technology would eventually reach. Instead, we found an enemy whose resistance seemed to exist somewhere beyond ordinary calculation, sustained not by strength or resources, but by something closer to identity itself, something that laughed in captivity and stood unarmed in front of sealed doors and refused, again and again, no matter the circumstance, to simply give up the fight. I remember returning to my quarters after that prisoner exchange and sitting alone for a long time, thinking about Torin, my friend from the listening post whose silence had started this entire war for me personally. I thought about Grace Bennett and her length of pipe. I thought about Daniel Ford laughing as he crossed an open field toward his own people, and I thought about Rurik Alm telling me he had felt like an aggressor facing 12 farmers in a storage building. I began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that we were not simply fighting a war against a technologically advancing species. We were fighting a war against an idea, a stubborn and unbreakable insistence on continuing forward, regardless of cost, regardless of odds, regardless of every reasonable calculation that should have told them to stop. And I began to understand that this idea, whatever we chose to call it, was far more dangerous than any weapon either of our species had ever built, because weapons could be countered, could be outmatched, could eventually be overcome through sufficient force and preparation. I did not yet know how you counter an idea. None of us did, and that uncertainty, more than any battle or any loss, was the thing that kept me awake in the quiet hours aboard our ships, wondering exactly what kind of war we had truly walked into, and whether our numbers and our technology would ever be enough to bring it to an end. The turning point of the war, at least for me personally, came during the 4th year of the conflict, at a battle our historians now call the engagement at Corin's Belt, though at the time it had no name at all, only coordinates, and a growing sense of dread among everyone assigned to that sector. By this point in the war, our fleet had adjusted its tactics significantly. We no longer approached human forces with the casual confidence of the early years. Our commanders had studied the pattern of unconventional resistance, the willingness to sacrifice smaller forces for larger strategic gain, the refusal to surrender even in hopeless circumstances, and had developed new doctrines designed to counter these tendencies. We brought overwhelming force to every engagement. We assumed every human position was more heavily defended than intelligence suggested. We planned for resistance that continued well past the point where any other species would have given up. Corin's Belt was meant to be different. It was a massive engagement, involving over 60 of our warships against a human defensive fleet that our best intelligence estimated at no more than 25 vessels, positioned to protect a shipbuilding facility that represented a significant portion of the humans' remaining production capacity in that region of space. If we destroyed that facility, our commanders believed, we would cripple the humans' ability to replace their losses for years to come, potentially ending the war through simple attrition. I had been promoted by this point to a command position of my own, overseeing a squadron of 4 support vessels responsible for coordinating repair and resupply operations during the battle. I was not on the front lines of the engagement, but I watched the entire battle unfold through our tactical displays, and what I saw that day changed everything I understood about what the humans were capable of when facing what should have been certain defeat. The battle began as our doctrine expected. We approached in overwhelming numbers, more than double the defending human force, and our commanders anticipated a difficult but ultimately decisive victory. What we did not anticipate was the depth of preparation the humans had invested into that shipbuilding facility over the preceding years. As our lead ships moved into attack position, the space around the facility itself began to change in ways our sensors struggled to interpret. Debris fields that our scans had recorded as simple industrial waste turned out to be carefully arranged sensor arrays, feeding real-time targeting data to the defending fleet with a precision our own systems could not match. Sections of the asteroid formations surrounding the facility had been hollowed out years earlier and fitted with automated defense platforms, dormant and undetectable until the moment they activated in perfect coordination with the human fleet's movements. 25 ships became something closer to 100 separate threats, all working together with a level of coordination that suggested planning, stretching back years before we ever arrived in that system. I remember watching our formation break apart under the strain of that unexpected complexity, ships forced into evasive patterns that separated them from their support, exactly the kind of vulnerability our doctrine had spent years trying to eliminate. And in the middle of that chaos, human ships moved with a precision that seemed almost impossible given the scale of the confusion around them, striking at exactly the moments when our formations were most vulnerable, then withdrawing before we could respond effectively. My own squadron was called forward roughly 2 hours into the battle, tasked with providing emergency repairs to a group of cruisers that had taken heavy damage attempting to breach the facility's outer defenses. It was during this operation that I lost someone whose name I have never been able to speak without pausing, even now, so many years later. Her name was Sevra Lin, a young technician who had served under my command for nearly 2 years, someone I had come to think of as something close to family in the strange way that long deployments create bonds between people who might never have known each other under ordinary circumstances. We were moving between two damaged cruisers, attempting to transfer emergency repair crews, when a small group of human fighters broke through our escort and targeted our support vessel directly. I remember the impact, the sudden alarm, the frantic effort to seal breached sections of the ship before atmosphere escaped entirely. Sevra Lin was in one of those sections. She did not survive. I will not pretend that I felt anything but grief and a kind of burning anger in the hours immediately following her loss. I wanted in that moment nothing more than to see every human ship in that system destroyed, to make them pay for what had been taken from me and from everyone else who lost someone that day. It is important that I tell you this honestly, because what happened next complicated that anger in ways I did not expect and have never fully resolved, even after all these years. As the battle continued into its 6th hour, our forces finally began to gain the advantage, our superior numbers slowly overwhelming the human defensive position, despite their remarkable preparation and coordination. The facility itself was heavily damaged, several human ships destroyed or disabled, and it became clear that the defending fleet could not hold the position much longer. At that point, rather than continuing to fight to the last possible ship, as we had come to expect from human forces in nearly every previous engagement, the surviving human commander made a decision that none of us anticipated. She ordered her remaining ships to begin evacuating civilian personnel from the facility itself, workers who had continued their duties throughout the entire battle, while simultaneously opening a communication channel to our fleet. I heard that transmission myself, relayed across our command network. The human commander, whose name I later learned was Claire Dawson, did not offer surrender in the traditional sense. She offered something else instead. She proposed a temporary cessation of hostilities, just long enough for the remaining civilian workers to be safely evacuated from the facility, promising that once evacuation was complete, she and her remaining ships would either surrender or continue fighting, whichever our commanders preferred, but asking that the civilians be allowed to leave without further attack. Our fleet commander at the time, an experienced officer named Voran Ashal, could easily have refused this request. We held the advantage. Continuing the attack without pause would likely have destroyed the remaining human ships and the facility itself far more quickly, potentially saving our own forces additional losses in the process. There was no rule of our engagement doctrine that required us to honor such a request from an enemy we had spent years learning to fear and distrust. He honored it anyway. I do not know exactly why Voran Ashal made that decision. I was not present in the command meetings where it was discussed, but I know that our fleet held its position for nearly 40 minutes while human transport vessels moved through the wreckage of that battle, evacuating workers who had no combat role in the conflict at all, people whose only involvement in the war was the simple fact that they built ships for a living. When the evacuation was complete, Claire Dawson kept her word. She ordered her remaining ships to stand down, and the battle at Corin's Belt ended not with the complete destruction of the human defensive fleet, but with a formal surrender, one of the first such surrenders of the entire war. I met Claire Dawson only once, several months later, during the negotiations that eventually led to a broader ceasefire agreement between our two species. I asked her, through a translator, why she had made that offer, when continuing to fight might have preserved more of her own forces in the long run, even at the cost of civilian lives. She told me that some things were simply not acceptable costs, regardless of what continuing the fight might have achieved militarily. She said that a victory purchased through the loss of people who had never chosen to fight was not a victory worth having, and that she would rather lose the battle honorably than win it through a compromise she could not live with afterward. I thought of Sevra Lin when she said this. I thought of the anger I had felt just hours before that transmission, the desire to see every human ship destroyed regardless of cost, and I found myself, uncomfortably, unable to hate the woman standing in front of me, despite everything her people had taken from me during that war. This is the part of the story that I find hardest to explain to younger soldiers who ask me about my time fighting the humans. They expect a simple narrative, either one of complete condemnation or complete admiration, and the truth is far more complicated than either extreme. The humans who fought against us were capable of tactics that caused us tremendous suffering, willing to sacrifice their own forces in ways that struck us as almost incomprehensible. And those same humans were also capable of moments like Corin's belt, choices that prioritize the protection of innocent lives over strategic advantage, even at significant cost to themselves. I left that battle having lost someone I cared for deeply, and having witnessed an act of restraint and honor from the very people responsible for that loss. Both of these things were true at once, and learning to hold both truths together, without letting one erase the other, was perhaps the most difficult lesson this entire war ever taught me. By the time Corin's belt had ended, I understood that we were not simply fighting an enemy who refused to break. We were fighting an enemy capable of extraordinary cruelty in pursuit of their goals, and extraordinary mercy when the cost of victory threatened to become something they could not accept. I did not know, in that moment, which of those two truths would ultimately define how this war ended. I only knew that the humans had proven, again and again, that they were far more complicated than any simple description our early reports had offered, and that understanding them would take far longer than defeating them ever could. The war ended 2 years after Corin's belt, not through the total victory either side had originally imagined, but through a negotiated peace that neither species fully wanted and both species, in the end, desperately needed. I was present at the final ceremony, standing among representatives from both fleets as the formal agreement was signed, and I remember thinking, as I watched human and Ostari officers exchange careful greetings for the first time without weapons drawn between them, that none of us truly understood yet what kind of peace we had just created, or whether it would last. It has lasted, as it turns out, far longer than most of us expected in those uncertain early days. It has been many years now since the fighting stopped, and in that time I have had the strange privilege of coming to know humans not as an enemy to be feared, but as colleagues, and in some cases, as friends. This transition did not happen quickly, and it did not happen without difficulty. There were years of caution on both sides, years of careful diplomatic work, years of small gestures building slowly toward something larger. But it did happen, and I have found myself, more than once, deeply grateful that it did. When young Ostari soldiers ask me now what it was like to fight against humans, they expect me to answer with stories of fear, and I do tell them those stories, because fear was certainly a part of what I felt throughout those 6 years. But fear alone does not capture the full truth of what I learned, and I think it is important, especially now, so many years later, to explain what that fuller truth actually was. We were not afraid of human weapons. I want to be very clear about that, because it is a common misunderstanding among those who did not live through the war themselves. Human technology for most of the conflict remained inferior to our own in nearly every measurable category. Their ships were smaller, their weapons in raw power were often weaker, their numbers, across most of the war, were significantly lower than ours. If the war had truly been a contest of resources and technology alone, it would have ended quickly and decisively in our favor. What we were afraid of was something far harder to measure and far harder to counter through simple military planning. We were afraid of an enemy that refused, in every conceivable circumstance, to simply stop. An enemy who fought as hard when outnumbered 20-1 as they did when the numbers favored them. An enemy who treated the protection of their wounded, their civilians, and even their own dignity as considerations equal to or greater than the calculations of strategic advantage that governed how the rest of us understood warfare. I think often about a conversation I had many years after the war ended with a human historian who had traveled to our homeworld as part of a cultural exchange program established during the early years of peace. Her name was Lily Turner, and she asked me many of the same questions young Ostari soldiers ask me now, wanting to understand what the war had looked like from our side of the conflict. I told her about Torin and the silence at the listening post that started everything for me personally. I told her about the battle at Astor Hollow and the 12 farmers who held a grain storage building for 4 hours against soldiers who should have overwhelmed them in minutes. I told her about Grace Bennett and her length of pipe, standing between an armed boarding party and 4 wounded strangers she barely knew. I told her about Daniel Ford laughing as he crossed an open field during a prisoner exchange, and about Claire Dawson at Corin's belt, choosing mercy over strategic advantage even in the middle of a battle she was losing. Lily Turner listened to all of this carefully, and when I finished, she told me something that has stayed with me ever since, something that I think finally helped me understand the humans in a way that 6 years of fighting against them never fully allowed. She told me that humans, throughout their long history, had fought countless wars against each other, long before they ever encountered our species or any other. And through that long history, certain values had been shaped and reinforced across countless generations. Values about protecting the vulnerable, about refusing to abandon those who depend on you, about finding a way to maintain hope and humor even in the darkest circumstances, because the alternative, giving in completely to despair, had proven throughout their history to be far more dangerous than continuing to resist, no matter how difficult that resistance became. She said that when humans encountered our species and found themselves facing an enemy with superior numbers and superior technology, they did not fight us with weapons alone. They fought us with everything their long history had taught them about survival against impossible odds. And that history, it turned out, was a weapon far more effective than anything either of our species had built in a laboratory or a shipyard. I found this explanation deeply moving when I first heard it, and I have carried it with me ever since. It helped me understand not just the war we fought, but the strange and complicated respect that so many of us who survived that war eventually developed for the very people who caused us so much suffering. I want to tell you about one more thing before I finish this account, something that happened just a few years ago, long after the war had ended and long after most of the world had moved past the immediate wounds of that conflict. I was serving aboard a joint research vessel, part of a combined Ostari and human scientific mission studying an unusual stellar phenomenon near the border our two species once fought so bitterly to control. The mission was entirely peaceful, staffed by scientists and engineers from both species working together toward a shared understanding of something neither of us could have studied alone. Among the human crew members aboard that vessel was an engineer named Owen Hale, a quiet and thoughtful man who had, I later learned, lost his father during the very battle at Astor Hollow that I described earlier, the battle that first taught our fleet what kind of enemy we were truly facing. I did not know this when I first met him. I only knew him as a skilled and reliable colleague, someone whose company I had come to enjoy over the months we served together. When I eventually learned about his father, during a quiet conversation late in our mission, I felt a familiar weight settle over me, a reminder of everything the war had cost both our species, and I found myself uncertain how to continue our friendship in the face of that knowledge. I did not know how to reconcile the comfortable companionship we had built with the fact that my own people had been responsible for the loss that shaped so much of his early life. Owen Hale noticed my hesitation, and he addressed it directly, in a way that I think captures something essential about the humans I came to know during and after that long war. He told me that he had grown up angry about his father's loss, angry in ways that took him many years to work through. But he said that anger alone had never brought his father back, and had never made his own life any better, and at some point he had decided that carrying that anger forward into every interaction with every Ostari he ever met would only ensure that the war continued to cost him something, long after the actual fighting had stopped. He said that peace was not something that simply happened when the fighting ended. He said it was something that had to be chosen, again and again, by ordinary people willing to set aside old wounds in favor of building something better, even when setting those wounds aside felt difficult, even when it felt, at times, almost unfair to the people who had been lost. I think about that conversation often, and I think it captures something important about why this account matters, not just as a record of what happened during the war, but as a guide for how two very different species eventually learned to build something lasting out of the wreckage that conflict left behind. We were afraid of the humans during the war for good reason. They fought with a determination that defied every calculation our doctrine relied upon, and that determination cost us dearly, in ships, in soldiers, and in the confidence we once carried into every engagement without question. I lost friends to that determination. I watched colleagues struggle to understand an enemy who simply refused, in every circumstance, to behave the way that reasonable calculation suggested they should. But I have also come to understand that this same determination, the same refusal to simply give up regardless of cost, is what eventually allowed humans and Ostari to build a genuine and lasting peace, once both species finally understood each other well enough to try. The very qualities that made humans such a formidable and frightening enemy during the war are the same qualities that make them steady and reliable partners now that the fighting has ended. People who honor their commitments, who protect those under their care, and who refuse to let old grievances prevent the building of something better for those who come after them. When young Ostari soldiers ask me what I learned from facing humans in battle, I tell them this. I tell them that strength is not only measured in weapons or numbers, but in the willingness to keep going when every reasonable calculation suggests you should stop. I tell them that mercy and determination are not opposites, but can exist together in the same people, sometimes in the very same moment, as I witnessed at Corin's Belt so many years ago. And I tell them that the peace we now share with the humans, however difficult it was to build, remains one of the things I am most grateful to have lived long enough to see. I think of Torin often, still, after all these years. I think of Sevra Lynn and the silence she left behind aboard that damaged support vessel. I think of everyone we lost during those 6 long years of conflict, on both sides of that terrible war. And I think, too, of Owen Hale, sitting across from me aboard a peaceful research vessel, choosing friendship over anger, choosing to build something new rather than carry the weight of something broken forward forever. That, I have come to believe, is the truest lesson this war ever taught me. We were not afraid of human weapons. We were afraid of the fact that they never ever stopped. And in the end, it was that very same refusal to stop, redirected now toward building peace instead of waging war, that gave both our species the chance to become something better than either of us could have managed alone. I am grateful, in ways I never expected to be when this all began, that we found our way to this ending instead of the one we once feared. And I hope, more than anything else I could tell you today, that those who come after us remember exactly how much that peace cost to build, so that they never take it for granted and never allow it to be lost again.